When it comes to Disney's most thrilling attractions, one of the first to come to mind is the Rock and Roller Coaster in Hollywood Studios, and it's hard to imagine the attraction without Aerosmith's incredible soundtrack. However, a rock and roller coaster without the Bad Boys of Boston was exactly what Disney had in mind while developing the attraction, so let's explore the fascinating history behind Disney World's most intense ride, the Rock and Roller Coaster Starring Aerosmith. Among the most common complaints from Disney World visitors throughout the 1970s and 80s was the lack of a truly thrilling experience for older visitors of the park. While Space Mountain in the Magic Kingdom was a fan favorite and among the fastest coasters in the US upon opening, parkgoers felt that Disney needed more to offer for the thrill-seeking crowd, and Imagineers agreed. With that information in mind, the Disney World Imagineering team initiated a long-term project in the early 1990s to begin integrating more mature and thrilling experiences into the Walt Disney World Resort, and over the course of the next decade, developed and opened several different thrill rides for their Orlando theme parks, including fan favorites like the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, Alien Encounter, and of course the Rock and Roller Coaster Starring Aerosmith. When Disney MGM Studios first opened in 1989, a plan was already in place for the park's first expansion, Sunset Boulevard, which opened in 1994 along with the expansion's focal point, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. While Disney had originally intended the Sunset Boulevard expansion to open with a second fully fledged attraction, a high-speed roller coaster themed around a rock and roll band, this second attraction was ultimately set aside to focus fully on the development of the Tower of Terror, and a plot of land was set aside for what Imagineers had envisioned from the start to be a rock and roll themed roller coaster. From the very beginning, Imagineers had intended for the ride's music to be provided by the Rolling Stones, but Disney was expecting a much lower asking price to use the Stones' music in the ride. When they approached frontman Mick Jagger and guitarist Keith Richards about using their music, both were very interested in the idea. That is, if Disney were willing to cough up a whopping $10 million per year in exchange for the rights to use their likenesses and excerpts from no more than 6 Rolling Stones songs. Disney scoffed at the asking price and decided to move forward with development of the coaster without a band attached to the ride. Construction officially began on the track for the Rock and Roller Coaster in February of 1998, and for over 5 months Disney searched for a band that would fit the rock and roll theme they were looking for, but wouldn't break the Disney bank in the process. Their second choice had originally been the Irish rock band U2, but that idea was very short-lived as frontman Bono had no interest in a partnership with Disney. By June of '98, Disney was starting to get desperate. The Rock and Roller Coaster's track construction was complete, all 3,403 feet of it, and the show building had begun to go up around the completed track, and still the Rock and Roller Coaster remained without a band to provide its soundtrack. During this time, Disney allegedly approached the band Kiss, who were experiencing a huge resurgence following their 1996 reunion tour, but again ran into the same problem as they had with the Rolling Stones, as frontmen Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons were asking for way more in licensing fees than Disney were willing to pay annually. Ultimately, Disney decided to turn to a band that they were already in business with, the Bad Boys of Boston, Aerosmith, who were currently contracted to record a new single for Disney's upcoming film, Armageddon. Aerosmith, despite having a nearly 3-decade-old career by 1998, were still extremely popular with mainstream radio. Although the vast majority of what many fans would consider their classic albums had released in the mid-1970s to varying levels of commercial success, the band had experienced significantly more worldwide mainstream popularity throughout the late 80s and 90s, with their biggest selling album of all time, Get a Grip, having released only 3 years earlier and selling upwards of 20 million copies. Despite the band's somewhat recent resurgence, Disney had been hesitant to consider Aerosmith for such a long-term coaster, as their most recent album, 1997's 9 Lives, had flopped critically and was their lowest-selling album in more than a decade. Upon realizing that Aerosmith was their next best option, Disney had still wanted to hold out until the film Armageddon released later that summer, hoping the single Aerosmith had recorded for the film, I Don't Wanna Miss a Thing, would be a hit and put their mind at ease. However, with construction of the track complete and Imagineers needing to move forward with development, Disney ultimately threw caution to the wind and approached Aerosmith frontman Steven Tyler, who absolutely loved the concept and luckily for Disney proved to be significantly more affordable than the Stones. And so the Rock and Roller Coaster became the Rock and Roller Coaster Starring Aerosmith. Disney worked with Aerosmith to come up with a selection of 8 songs that guests would hear while riding the coaster. The band had only one requirement and request, and that was that the ride featured at least one song from their newest album, which is how the album's title track 9 Lives, which was never a hit single to begin with, ended up among bona fide classics like Walk This Way, Sweet Emotion, and Dude Looks Like a Lady. Aerosmith also agreed to re-record certain lyrics to a few of their classic songs just to better fit the theme of the attraction, which included changing the Aerosmith staple Love in an Elevator to Love in a Roller Coaster. With everything settled with the band, Imagineers were then free to finish up development of the attraction, filming a pre-show starring the band and decorating the queue with music equipment that was almost exclusively donated by the band themselves. From the very beginning, the Rock and Roller Coaster was slated to open in summer of 1999, and despite a half-year struggle to find a band to theme the attraction around, Disney were able to meet the deadline without issue. The grand opening ceremony was held on July 29th of 1999 and was a very private invitation-only event attended by all members of the band. Parkgoers lucky enough to score an invitation to the event had the opportunity to ride the coaster with one of the band's members, who could be found at random on the attraction during the event. Steven Tyler and lead guitarist Joe Perry reportedly loved the attraction so much they rode it 12 times in a row before heading out. After the opening ceremony had wrapped and the band had left the park, the ride was now open for the public to experience. After passing the large red Stratocaster and entering the show building, which was themed to be a fictitious record company by the name of G-Force Records, a play on the G-Force that riders would soon experience on the coaster, guests would pass by various posters promoting various pop and rock acts, both old and new. They would also have a chance to view old equipment from several different eras of Aerosmith's history as they waited to enter the main pre-show area. Once in, they would find themselves in Aerosmith's very own recording studio and would walk in on the band cutting tracks for their newest record. Shortly after entering the room, the band is told they have to leave as quickly as possible or they would miss their show on the other end of town. So the band makes their way out to a waiting limousine. As he heads out, Joe Perry stops to ask someone named Chris to grab his black Les Paul. Originally, during the first few years of the attraction, a cast member would actually grab a black Les Paul off the physical set that was allegedly an authentic guitar previously owned by Joe Perry and would pretend to deliver it backstage. This effect was retired in recent years for an unknown reason, although it's been rumored that many of the set pieces were stolen off the stage during this segment. As the band is about to leave, Steven Tyler notices the manager hasn't provided any accommodations for the waiting fans and makes sure the fans are taken care of before leaving.
Hey, wait a minute. We can't leave these people here like this.
We can't?
No. Come on, you know how we feel about our fans.
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, guys, what do you expect me to do? Is send them all with you?
Yeah. Wait a minute. I love that idea. How about some backstage passes?
Oh,
yeah. Come on. Make it happen. Give us something.
Okay, I'll make it happen. Now get out of here. I hate all of you.
See ya. Have a nice ride.
Following this, the band's manager calls for an ultra-fast super stretch limo for the guests and would then direct everyone out into the alley to make their way to the concert across town. Each of the 5 different coaster trains features a completely different soundtrack, so each coaster would provide a very different experience. Upon being secured into the seats, guests would hear a countdown from Steven Tyler through the 6 different speakers in their headrest and the single subwoofer underneath their seat. And as the countdown reaches 1, the intro to the song begins, and guests are launched from 0 to 60 in under 2.8 seconds. As the coaster travels down a long straightaway, guests would experience an intense sea serpent rollover before continuing along, passing by various road signs from the Hollywood area as they sped towards the finish line. The coaster would then do one final corkscrew before reaching the end of the track and dropping guests off at the red carpet, where Aerosmith can be seen performing their encore. Guests would then exit through a gift shop and make their way back into the park. Reviews for the ride were almost universally positive. As a roller coaster, it was by far Disney's most intense, and was Disney's first coaster to feature inversions, which was a very big deal at the time. In fact, the ride was so well received that Disney decided to open another rock and roller coaster less than 3 years later as an opening day attraction for the Walt Disney Studios park in Disneyland Paris. The Rock and Roller Coaster in Paris has the same exact track layout as the original version in Hollywood Studios, but the story of the ride is almost entirely different. Instead of riders taking a limousine to a concert across town, the pre-show establishes that riders will be testing out brand new technology the band has been working on called sound trackers for Aerosmith's brand new music video. The sounds used in the various coaster trains are the exact same as the original, but instead of passing by traffic signs on the coaster, guests simply pass by flashing strobe lights. The Rock and Roller Coaster at Disneyland Paris holds the unique distinction of being the fastest coaster in all of France, as it faces much less stiff competition than its US counterpart. Quite unusually for a Disney attraction, the Rock and Roller Coaster has remained largely unchanged throughout its now 20-year history. The ride was given a one-night Star Wars overlay in 2015, just to celebrate the release of The Force Awakens, with Star Wars music replacing Aerosmith's, but the very next day the ride was reverted back to its original form. The only significant permanent modification was in the form of a relatively controversial change in 2016, when Disney decided to digitally alter Steven Tyler's hand in the Hollywood Studios pre-show to remove what some parkgoers saw as an obscene gesture. While rumors have swirled for years that the Rock and Roller Coaster would soon be closing for a complete retheme, nothing came of these rumors until the 2018 D23 Expo, when Disney announced that the Disneyland Paris version of the Rock and Roller Coaster would be permanently closing to be replaced by an Iron Man themed coaster. While Disney would be more than happy to integrate that same idea into the Hollywood Studios version, their agreement with Universal Studios prevents them from using any of the core Avengers characters within the Orlando theme park, so for now, the Aerosmith train will keep a-rolling in Disney's Hollywood Studios. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoy this type of content, be sure to check out our weekly Yesterworld podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud, and we'll see you here next time on Yesterworld.